Imagine for a moment a high-stakes meeting. The room is silent, thick with tension. A brilliant executive is presenting a groundbreaking strategy to her board. It is logically airtight, backed by flawless data, and projected to double their growth. Yet, as she speaks, you can see the physical shift in the room. Crossed arms, tight jaws, defiant glances. Why? Because the human brain does not like being told what to do. The moment she says, "We absolutely must adopt this path, and there is no other logical choice," a subtle, ancient mechanism in the brains of everyone at that table fires up. In psychology, we call this psychological reactance. It is the motivational state that arises when our freedom of choice is threatened. The brain doesn't register a great idea. It registers a threat to its autonomy. The amygdala sounds a quiet alarm, and suddenly, highly intelligent leaders begin looking for reasons to say no, not because the idea is bad, but because they desperately need to reclaim their sense of control. Now, contrast that with another scenario. A father is trying to get his stubborn toddler to eat broccoli. If he commands, "Eat your vegetables," a power struggle ensues. The child's brain locks into resistance. But if the father sits down, eats the broccoli with obvious relish, and says, "This is adult food. It's a bit too special for you right now. Maybe when you're older." What happens? The child's focus shifts from defending their autonomy to desiring the forbidden. The child demands the broccoli. This is the primitive, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying machinery of the human mind. Throughout our lives, we are locked in an invisible, constant tug of war. We try to push people toward better decisions, our children, our partners, our colleagues, our clients, only to find that the harder we push, the harder they pull back. We end up exhausted, frustrated, and disconnected. We mistake their resistance for stubbornness or malice, when in reality, it is simply a biological reflex. What if you could drop the rope? What if, instead of pulling harder, you stepped aside and let their own momentum carry them exactly where they need to go? This is the essence of reverse control. It is not about trickery or hollow manipulation. It is about emotional attunement. It is the sophisticated art of understanding the neurological levers of human resistance and learning how to gently, ethically align them. When you master these 14 laws, you stop fighting human nature and you start working with it. You transform from an enforcer of compliance into a master of emotional navigation. When people feel their autonomy threatened, their brains trigger a defensive emotional response. Reverse psychology isn't a parlor trick. It is the strategic redirection of this survival-based neural resistance. Direct demands often trigger the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, causing immediate pushback. By framing options indirectly, we bypass this threat response, allowing the prefrontal cortex to make what it believes is an independent, rational choice. To gain influence, you must first be willing to surrender the appearance of control. True emotional intelligence lies in letting go of the ego's need to win the initial argument to achieve the healthier, collective outcome. You cannot apply the laws of reverse psychology without deep cognitive empathy, the ability to understand exactly how another person thinks, what they fear, and what drives their need for defiance. Influence without empathy is manipulation. The ultimate goal of these 14 laws is not to deceitfully bend others to your will, but to unlock stalemates, help people overcome their own self-sabotaging mental blocks, and foster healthier relational dynamics. The human brain is a masterpiece of survival, and at the core of that survival is a deeply rooted need for autonomy. When we analyze the anatomy of resistance, we must first look at a phenomenon known in social psychology as cognitive or psychological reactance. This is not merely a behavioral quirk or a sign of stubbornness. It is a fundamental neurological reflex. The moment an individual perceives that their freedom of choice is being restricted, threatened, or outright eliminated, a quiet alarm sounds within the limbic system. The amygdala, our brain's emotional radar, registers this restriction as a threat to self-determination. In response, it triggers a motivational state aimed directly at restoring that lost freedom. Suddenly, the actual value of the object or action in question becomes secondary to the preservation of personal liberty. The brain begins to crave the restricted option simply because it is restricted. This is the classic pull of the forbidden fruit, a psychological force so potent that it can override logic, self-interest, and previous agreements. In everyday interactions, we see this play out in a perpetual, exhausting cycle of push and pull. When a manager tells a team member, "You absolutely must do it this way," or when a parent insists, "You are not allowed to go there," they believe they are exerting control. In reality, they are triggering reactance. The other person's brain immediately deprioritizes the request itself and refocuses all of its cognitive energy on reclaiming its independence. The forbidden option undergoes a rapid, unconscious inflation of value. This is where the strategic application of reverse psychology becomes essential. Instead of pushing against this natural neurological tide, we must learn to work with it. To redirect this survival-based neural resistance, we must shift our approach from demanding compliance to strategically framing the desired path as a scarce or restricted privilege. When you position a goal, a task, or a behavior not as a mandatory obligation, but as something that is limited, highly selective, or perhaps even too difficult or restricted for them at this moment, you flip the motivational switch. The individual's brain no longer feels pressured to defend its autonomy because no one is pushing them. Instead, because the option is framed as restricted or challenging, their natural drive to overcome barriers is activated. Their focus shifts from resisting your control to proving their own capability and securing the restricted prize. They begin to actively pursue the very outcome you desired, fully believing that the choice to do so is entirely their own. This is the art of bypassing the amygdala's defenses. By understanding that resistance is a biological reflex, we stop taking pushback personally. We realize that the hardest door to open is the one we try to kick down, whereas a door that is slightly, enticingly closed with a sign that says, "Staff only," naturally invites everyone to peek inside. By mastering this first law, you transition from a force of friction to a facilitator of self-directed motivation, allowing others the freedom to discover and choose the right path on their own terms. To truly master the art of influence, one must understand the delicate, silent struggle occurring within the human brain between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. When we present someone with a direct, uncompromising command, we are not appealing to their rational mind. Instead, we are inadvertently launching a direct assault on their sense of agency, triggering what is known as an amygdala hijack. The amygdala, that ancient sentinel of our emotional brain, does not process nuance or logic in moments of perceived threat. It processes survival. And to the social brain, a sudden loss of autonomy is a survival threat. When a person feels cornered, their prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, rational decision-making, and long-term planning, is effectively taken offline, replaced by an immediate defensive reflex to push back, reject, and rebel. To bypass this automatic defense mechanism, we must employ the law of the illusion of choice. This is not a deceptive trick, but a sophisticated cognitive framework that respects the brain's biological need for self-determination. Instead of offering a single, heavy-handed directive that invites a simple yes or no battle, we present multiple, carefully curated pathways. By restructuring the choice architecture, we shift the individual's mental state from a binary struggle of submission versus rebellion to an active, analytical process of evaluation. When a person is presented with options, the amygdala remains calm because it does not perceive an existential threat to its freedom. Because there is no immediate force to resist, the prefrontal cortex is allowed to remain online and engaged. The brain shifts its focus from "how do I defend my freedom" to "which of these paths serves me best?" In practice, this requires a deliberate relinquishment of our own need to dominate the conversation. If you want a colleague to adopt a highly detailed, rigorous project management system, presenting it as the sole, mandatory workflow will almost certainly invite subtle sabotage or passive resistance. Instead, you might present two distinct options. The first is the highly organized, structured system, which you frame as demanding but highly efficient for keeping stakeholders off their back. The second is a loose, highly chaotic, manual reporting method, which you frame as offering complete freedom but requiring frequent, grueling status meetings to compensate for the lack of structure. By presenting these two paths, you have not forced their hand. You have handed them the steering wheel. The brain, looking at these options, will naturally gravitate toward the structured system, not because they were told to, but because their prefrontal cortex evaluated the choices and concluded that it was the more rational, self-beneficial route. They choose the path of structure because they want to avoid the friction of the alternative. In their mind, they have made an independent, empowered decision. They have won their autonomy, and in doing so, they have willingly stepped directly into the productive outcome you envisioned. When we enter into a disagreement, our natural biological reflex is to gird ourselves for battle. We brace our posture, sharpen our arguments, and prepare to meet force with force. But in the theater of human psychology, matching force with force only serves to validate and strengthen the other person's resistance. This is because direct opposition acts as a solid wall against which the other person can lean, push, and stabilize their own counter-argument. When you push back, you give them the leverage they need to keep fighting. The third law, the law of strategic relinquishment, demands that we perform a highly counterintuitive, emotionally intelligent maneuver. We must drop our side of the rope and agree with the very premise of their resistance. To understand why this is so remarkably effective, we must look at the physical and psychological dynamics of momentum. When someone is fully prepared to launch a heavy counter-argument, their mind is flooded with adrenaline, and their cognitive defenses are locked in an active state of high tension. They expect you to push back. They have already rehearsed their defense. If you instead step aside and agree with their core objection, you remove the physical and emotional resistance they were relying on to maintain their posture. Psychologically, they stumble forward into empty air. By validating their perspective, by saying, "You are entirely right, this project might indeed be too complex for us to execute under this timeline," you instantly disarm their defensive posture. Because there is no longer an opponent to fight, the brain's threat detection system stands down, and the adrenaline begins to clear. Once the resistance is neutralized, a fascinating cognitive shift occurs. Because you have validated their concern, you have proven that you are not their adversary, but a rational, empathetic partner. The ego no longer needs to defend its position because it has already won the argument. With the threat to their autonomy removed, The other person's brain naturally seeks to restore balance and demonstrate capability. If you have agreed that the task is perhaps too difficult, or the timeline too aggressive for their current capacity, their ego faces a new, subtle challenge: the implication of limitation. Human nature detests feeling incapable. Now that they do not have to fight you for their freedom, they will often begin to argue for their own competence. They might say, "Well, it's not that we can't do it. We would just need to reallocate some resources." Or, "I didn't say it was impossible, just that it would require a highly focused effort." By strategically surrendering the need to be right, you have guided them to a position where they are actively selling themselves on the solution. This is the power of the emotional pivot. It requires immense self-regulation to swallow our initial urge to defend our ideas. But the reward is a complete transformation of the relational dynamic. You move from a state of exhausting friction to a state of collaborative problem-solving, where the other person willingly takes ownership of the challenge because they feel completely heard, respected, and in control of their own choices. To successfully employ any sophisticated form of psychological influence, we must look beyond the superficial mechanics of behavior and anchor our approach in the deepest domain of emotional intelligence: empathy. It is a common misconception that reverse psychology is a cold, calculated strategy of manipulation, a set of verbal tricks designed to outsmart an opponent. In reality, any attempt to guide another person's choices without deep emotional attunement is not only bound to fail, but it also risks destroying the fragile trust that holds relationships together. True attunement is the ability to map the internal emotional landscape of another human being. It requires us to move past basic sympathy and step fully into the realm of cognitive empathy, the deliberate, intellectual task of understanding exactly how another person thinks, what they value, what they fear, and what drives their unique need for defiance. Every act of resistance we encounter in our personal or professional lives is a message wrapped in a hard, protective shell. When an employee pushes back against a new initiative, or when a partner retreats into silence, they are rarely reacting to the objective reality of the situation. Instead, they are responding to an internal narrative shaped by their own unspoken anxieties. Perhaps they fear a loss of competence in a changing environment, or perhaps they feel their past contributions are being dismissed and unseen. If we respond only to their outward defiance, we engage in a superficial clash of wills. But when we practice deep cognitive empathy, we pause to ask ourselves, what is the underlying emotional state driving this resistance? What does this person need to feel safe, respected, and valued? Only when we can accurately diagnose the root cause of their defensiveness can we hope to speak to them in a way that bypasses their guard. This level of psychological insight requires an active, disciplined quietness within ourselves. We must temporarily suspend our own agenda, our own urge to be right, and our own emotional reactions to their pushback. This is what we call social awareness, the capacity to sense the subtle emotional currents flowing beneath the surface of an interaction. It is about reading the micro-expressions, noticing the shifts in tone, and recognizing the silent pleas for autonomy that are often masked as arrogance or stubbornness. When we are attuned to these signals, we can tailor our words to match the exact frequency of their emotional state. We can intentionally present ideas in a way that respects their boundaries, because we finally understand where those boundaries are drawn. Without this empathetic calibration, our attempts at influence become clumsy and transparent. If you try to use the laws of reverse psychology mechanically, treating people as simple input-output machines, their radar for insincerity will immediately sound the alarm. They will sense the underlying disrespect of being managed rather than heard. But when your approach is grounded in genuine empathy, the dynamic shifts entirely. You are no longer trying to control them. You are seeking to understand them so deeply that you can help them step out of their own way. You recognize that their defiance is often a defense mechanism against vulnerability. By honoring that vulnerability and offering them the psychological safety of autonomy, you allow them to lower their defenses. In this space of mutual respect, the need for a tug-of-war simply dissolves, and true collaborative connection begins to flourish. As we navigate the complex landscape of human interaction, we must confront a vital boundary: the thin, highly critical line that separates constructive influence from cold manipulation. The techniques we have explored, the strategic shifts in language, the deliberate creation of psychological space, and the tempering of our own egos, are incredibly powerful instruments of human psychology. But power without a moral compass is inherently destructive. If these 14 laws are used merely as tools to deceitfully bend others to our will, to extract compliance for selfish gain, or to treat human beings as chess pieces to be maneuvered, we have crossed into the territory of manipulation. Manipulation is a profound failure of emotional intelligence. It views relationships as zero-sum games, and while it might yield temporary, short-term victories, it ultimately leaves a trail of resentment, eroded trust, and broken connections in its wake. The ultimate measure of our emotional maturity is how we calibrate our influence to ensure it is always grounded in deep, authentic empathy. Ethical calibration begins with a clear-eyed examination of our intent. We must ask ourselves, whose interest does this choice ultimately serve? When used ethically, reverse psychology is not a weapon to defeat an opponent, but a therapeutic tool to unlock destructive stalemates. In our work, our families, and our communities, we frequently encounter situations where individuals are trapped in their own self-sabotaging mental blocks. An exceptionally talented colleague might refuse a promotion out of a deep-seated fear of failure, masking their anxiety as indifference. A child might refuse to study out of a rebellious need to assert independence, even though they desperately want to succeed. In these moments, direct pressure only solidifies their self-destructive path. By applying these laws ethically, we are not tricking them. We are performing a form of psychological rescue. We are carefully dismantling the ego defenses and neural resistance that prevent them from acting in their own best interest. We are helping them step out of the mental prisons they have built for themselves, creating a safe clearing where their rational, forward-thinking prefrontal cortex can finally take the lead. This approach turns influence into an act of profound service. It requires us to cultivate a state of relational mindfulness, recognizing that our emotional states are deeply contagious. When we approach a conflict with the sole objective of winning, we transmit that adversarial energy, forcing the other person into a defensive crouch. But when we anchor our strategy in empathy, our goal shifts from winning the argument to healing the relationship. We use these laws to lower the emotional temperature of the room, to dissolve the invisible barriers of pride, and to foster healthier, more resilient relational dynamics. We allow the other person to retain their dignity, their autonomy, and their pride, even as we help them pivot toward a more constructive path. Ultimately, the true purpose of reverse control is to build a bridge of psychological safety. It is about fostering an environment where cooperation is not a concession, but a shared victory. When we master this ethical calibration, we no longer need to force others to follow us. Instead, we create the relational space where they can willingly, joyfully discover the best version of themselves.